9, 1-800.
We live in an age where the chance of
sounds incredibly complex. It sounds like students, you need to have abilities that span. I'm really geeking out here.
And so I hope my next question doesn't kind of stray into the political. Sounds like you spent a lot of time in Japan. We've spent a lot of time in France, through our campus there, spent a lot of time in Paris. So really familiar with really just the cultural aspect of transportation and how much it is part of everyday life. And what I'm really curious is like you described what was happening in Japan, and it's just top to bottom. They're organized, they're thorough. They know exactly what it is they're doing. And whereas I don't want to say there's less of that in the US, because clearly it sounds like they're, MARTA and others are doing work. But I'm wondering if there's just simply a cultural element to how it is there's, both the appreciation of public transportation in the US and say Japan, and then as well as kind of the COVID response, say the cultural response differences between the U.S.
I think the cultural aspects are huge. I mean, this is way before COVID. This has been an aspect of the work that I do, is thinking about how culture impacts different policy decisions that we make around transportation, and then even how those policies and decisions that we make then affect our culture as well, right? This is kind of a two-way thing. I also take students to the Netherlands, and in that course, we talk a lot about building bike infrastructure and how, this is a low-lying country, so they care a lot about the potential of sea level rise, right? And so culturally, they're going to emphasize things that are going to make transportation more sustainable. But then at the same time, because they've adopted this bike culture, that then affects how, people are supposed to dress, and, other aspects of their culture are very much affected by the fact that people are biking. So I think that the same is true in Japan, in places where transit is really the backbone of their transportation system. That's really, really important to them, and they're going to do anything they can to stabilize that system and make sure that it's working. And so, at a time like COVID, they're going to throw a lot of resources at that. To the U.S.'s credit, though, the initial stimulus bill, transit was a huge part of that stimulus package, right?
Is that right?
The U.S. is trying to do things to make sure that these transit agencies can do what they need to. But at the same time, transit is traditionally very underfunded, and a lot of these agencies are working kind of on bare bones. And so they can't provide the same level of service that the agencies in Japan can. And that stems back to deeper cultural things where, we are very automobile centric in the US, and sort of overcoming that is never going to be an easy thing.
Well, a couple of times you mentioned your students, and so I'd love to hear more about the kinds of students that come to your lab. What kind of backgrounds do they have, and more about how you like to run your lab and the culture of your lab.
Sure. So the kinds of students who come to my lab, I would say I tend to attract very passionate students. My students, as a rule, are the types who walk into my door because they want to change the world. There's something they see with the transportation system that they think is broke, and they have ideas around how we're going to fix it. And they want to be able to do research to help them in those endeavors. And I think others who you would talk to in my department would say, "Yup, that's a Watkins student for sure." They tend to be the movers and the shakers, and the ones who are, taking on leadership roles within our department and such, because I think they want to see change in transportation, but they also want to see change in other ways. I tend to have a pretty diverse group in terms of gender. I think as a female professor, I tend to attract more female PhD students, and that's actually a particular focus of mine, is helping more women go into academia. So not just my own students, but trying to mentor other professors' students. It's not my colleagues' fault that they're male. And so I'm willing to help them out by mentoring their female students when they feel like they need a female mentor in their lives. I would say over the past couple of weeks, I'm a little embarrassed that there's maybe not more ethnic diversity in my lab. And I think that's something that I've personally set as a goal, to try to rectify that a little bit more. But I think on the whole, I've got a group that's very collaborative, that loves to work together with other people and draw other people into our group. And like I said, they tend to be those let's change this world and make it a better place types.
What kind of preparation would you recommend to a student? Because you're right. I'll bet you there's a bunch of students listening to this that are exactly the passionate students that you're talking about. And they say, I'd give anything to be in Dr. Watkins' lab. And so what kind of preparation would you suggest, even to a junior high or high school student that really is drawn to kind of the passion that you and your students have?
Yeah. So I do expect that the people coming into my lab have a pretty good basis in terms of their ability to do statistics, that, they sort of have the mathematical chops to be able to run some of the models that we're going to be running. So those things are important. I like to attract students from different backgrounds, though. So a lot of the students in my lab are not necessarily civil engineers all throughout their career. I have a PhD student right now whose background was public health. My postdoc was a math major. I've got several civil engineers, but I've had people with backgrounds in city and regional planning. They have to not be afraid of the math part of things, but we are at an excellent institution that can fill in those gaps for people who want to be learning those things. And so that's the beauty of a PhD, and most of the people in my lab are PhD students. I very much focus on PhD, although I have quite a few master's students as well where they are industry bound, and I like to mentor master's students who are industry bound. But with my PhD students, I'm usually looking for folks who are on the academic track. I guess another part of what I like to do is be a professor maker. So I like to help these folks that kind of want to follow in my footsteps, and they don't just like research, but they really like education and service and academia as a whole, and they want to learn how to do academia right. And so to me, that's a big part of their training too. So I'm looking for people who, I guess, have that passion and, aren't afraid of the hard work that it takes to fill any gaps in their background to get there.
Well, one of the things that we often ask on the podcast is, how you found your way to becoming an engineer, whether it was, elementary school or later on, if you grew up in a family that had engineers. I'm really curious, again, because I think a lot of our listeners are junior high and high school students. They love to hear your story about how you found your way to becoming an engineer.
I think my story about this will also explain a little bit more about my particular passion for travel as education, which in the time of COVID is a very hard passion to have. But I do teach a lot of study abroad courses, and this stems back from my path to engineering was as a 16-year-old. I grew up in Detroit. I was surrounded by the auto industry. Everyone in my life worked for the auto industry. And at 16, I was an exchange student in Germany, and it rocked my world. From that moment on, I knew that I wanted to do not just engineering, but transportation engineering. I literally wanted to be the person, fixing bus and bike and all of these things. So I think I'm a unique individual that I knew at 16 pretty much what I wanted to do, and that path has not really changed since then. And I'm quite a bit more than 16 now. So I think transportation was something that I've always been very passionate about. And I thought the biggest way that I could make a good paycheck and at the same time sort of change the world in the world of transportation was through engineering. And so I decided civil engineering, and I went to Georgia Tech, the greatest school in the universe, to get my undergraduate engineering degree in civil and environmental engineering. And then I left Tech for quite some time, and I was fortunate enough to circle back when I became a professor.
I had an opportunity to sit in on a meeting with a number of senior executives from the auto industry, U.S. auto industry, and kind of triangulating around what's happening in public transportation, what's happening in personal transportation, i.e., I buy my own car and drive it 17 hours a day, versus Uber and Lyft. It just feels like, if I was going to guess, I was going to say the forces seem to be coming together to really push, even, once we get through the pandemic, Uber and Lyft, people are not crazy about taking Uber and Lyft because they don't know, the health of the driver. But it feels like kind of the forces that you're talking about are kind of pushing people, either because of telework or because, all of the things that you just said. It seems like ride sharing, kind of Uber and Lyft, is going to be, I don't know, a winner or something like that. There's going to be an even greater push towards that. Should I just stop trying to be a crystal ball predictor, or does that make sense?
I think so. It makes sense to a certain extent, right? Giving people the flexibility to travel in the way that Uber and Lyft do can be a good thing. But we have to remember that these are more expensive trips than a transit trip. And so, as you cut ridership by people using Uber and Lyft instead, then you're talking about, less people that are being served by these fixed route transit services. The model that we're looking at, like people who do a lot of future of transportation kinds of things, a much better model is to have transit services that run in dedicated right-of-way where, they really have priority over vehicles, and we can make this very speedy. And it's an obvious choice for lots of people, right? And that this is fed with better micromobility. So the scooters and the bikes and all these kinds of things are getting people to these lines. And then even services like Uber and Lyft that, if you're coming a little bit longer of a distance, you're using those to feed into these kind of high capacity lines. And not as much of this model of us running a bus that's going up and down all of these different streets, and it takes forever for it to finally get to the higher capacity lines, because that's not necessarily the most efficient thing for transit agencies to be doing. So there's a lot of us at Tech who are doing research looking at what we call microtransit, micromobility, and kind of the ties of this fixing what we call the first mile, last mile problem, in order to try to get people to these more high capacity transit services.
For Doraville Station.